I've got to wait a second. Right, thanks, Helen. Good evening, folks. As Mike said, I'm David Henry. I served as a volunteer on the Kirkcudbright Lifeboat from 1974 until the year 2000, which covers the era of the Mary Pullman and then latterly the Atlantic 21. Not a Kirkcudbright man myself. I come from Dundrennan, from foreign parts. But having married Faith in the late 70s and obviously been involved in her before that, lifeboats became quite a large part of my life. So I'm going to start off the talk with a little history of the RNLI itself, a bit of a backstory, what the RNLI is about, how it was founded. So back in the very early 1800s, well, 1823, Sir William Hillary of Douglas in the Isle of Man, having been involved in and seen several disasters unfold in Douglas Bay, decided that he could no longer sit back and watch this death and destruction that was going on around him without doing something about it. So in late 23, Sir William approached the Admiralty with a grand plan of how to save lives and property from shipwreck. The Admiralty threw him out without any further discussion. But undeterred, he went back to Douglas and had a rethink. And then he decided a more philanthropic approach might be the best plan. So he, with a few influential friends, met in a pub in London. I'm going to have to look at the name of it for a moment. The City of London Tavern. So over a pint on the 4th of March in 1824, he and some friends come up with the notion that they would set up what was to become the RNLI, but known at the time as the National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck. Snappy title. He and his pals managed to raise some funds and also managed to raise the interest of King George IV, who offered royal patronage. Hence, it became the Royal National Institution of Saving Life from Shipwrecks. So things set off at a pace. Things worked very well. Money was coming in. Their wealthy friends were providing enough support. But over the years, the money began to fade, and the lifeboat became a bit strapped for cash until a lady called Grace Darling came along, and her and her father on the Farne Islands off the northeast coast of England performed a rescue one evening, which became nationally recognised. She became, I think I've said, the first social media heroine. She became famous overnight for the rescue, to the point where people were writing to her in huge numbers, and she had to ignore most of it. Most of the requests were for lockets of her hair, which she, I think, refused to send. Unfortunately, poor Grace died 4 years after the rescue of TB, so she didn't have a long time to suffer from the problems of fame. But that, again, highlighted the need for money and support for the RNLI. So, again, money was abound. But again, it needed another trigger. And unfortunately, the next trigger was a total disaster at Southport and St Anne's lifeboat, where both boats were lost with all their crew, leaving 27 women as widows and 50 children without their fathers. And this became a national disaster, a bit like Aberfan of our time. The country was in an uproar. So money was raised through collections at that point. And they discovered, by forming a ladies' guild to organise the fundraising, ladies being well organised, getting things put together, a sum of £10,000 was raised in a period of 2 weeks, which is equivalent to 1.2 million in today's money. So from being quite strapped for cash, the lifeboat organisation became a bit more lucrative. Later in 1891, a wealthy industrialist in Manchester, Sir Charles Macara, he and his wife organised the first charity day for the lifeboat, where they organised a lifeboat, bands, dancing girls, whatever, a huge parade through the streets of Manchester, and again, raising £5,000 in the one day, so £600,000 raised in a day. So the money began to pour into the lifeboat organisation, which could then support places like ourselves. At that time, there were approximately 1,800 shipwrecks around the coast of the UK every year. Now, you can just imagine the destruction and carnage, not only in the loss of commerce, but the loss of life became untenable, really. Something had to be done. This is where the lifeboat came in. So, why does Kirkcudbright need a lifeboat? It didn't have one until the early 1862. The first boat came to Kirkcudbright. But at that time, these photographs are a shot of the Manxman's Lake. The top photograph is a vessel unloading its cargo in Manxman's Lake. It's difficult to see, but the quality of the pictures isn't all that great. This vessel here, it's over towards the Isle unloading grain. And this was very common practice. Vessels would anchor in the bay, wait in Manxman's Lake for a suitable tide, and then be unloaded in the bay. However, much earlier on the 11th of March, 1822, a storm not like Storm Eowyn that we've just had blew through Kirkcudbright Bay. 12 vessels were wrecked that evening. 5 as total write-offs. 3 as total write-offs, and 5 were blown ashore. And we're talking vessels of this nature and bigger. A vessel called the Dido and the Wellington, they both washed ashore at the Isle Point and were totally wrecked. However, all the crew managed to get ashore. The Falcon, the Joshua, and the Mary Isabella, however, lost their entire crew minus 1. So at daybreak on the 12th of March, Kirkcudbright Bay was littered with 15 bodies and 12 shipwrecks, sorry. So again, this became difficult. And that was a one-off shot. This was happening every year, not in those numbers, so that was quite a catastrophic day, but there was always a ship being lost in or around Kirkcudbright Bay. So as I say, in 1861, a local lifeboat committee was formed in the town, and the information I've got is they demanded that a lifeboat be sent to Kirkcudbright. I think they probably requested it, but the story goes they demanded a lifeboat. So the Lifeboat Institution sent an inspector, as they do, and the inspector had a look around and had a chat, obviously, with the committee, and decided, yes, a lifeboat for Kirkcudbright was required. However, the locals had to find a total of £144 to build a boathouse, which again is the equivalent of today is £15,000. Now, quite strangely, the lifeboat at the moment are raising money to improve their boathouse, and there will be a collection at the end of the evening. There's a bucket in the back table. So we're looking for about £15,000 tonight if we can. But sure enough, the money was found and the boat would be provided. So the boat arrived on the 8th of July, 1862. It was taken straight to the harbour, a crew was put aboard, and they were launched. They had a row around the harbour, basically. The boat itself would resemble this one. This is not the Kirkcudbright lifeboat. I could not find anywhere a picture of the Helen Lees, which is a lifeboat here from 1862 until 1880. So this is the first type of boat on station. This is how it was transported. But because we don't have a railway station yet, but Castle Douglas do, it was delivered to Castle Douglas railway station and had to be pulled by horses to Kirkcudbright. She was a pulling, sailing type of lifeboat. That means that she had oars and a sail. The sail was used to assist the oarsmen. It's damn sight easier to sail than to row. So if you've got a favourable wind, you could use the sail and the oars, or just the oars. So she would sail or row. A casualty capacity of 17. I don't know where on earth they were going to put 17 people on these boats. And it had 4 service launches, saving 17 lives in its time here. Apparently, so I've learned, the plan for rowing the boat was there would be 12 oarsmen aboard the boat, and 8 oarsmen would row at any one time, leaving 4 to catch their breath. And these 4 would substitute for any oarsman that was becoming tired. There'd also be a bowman in charge of the bow, a coxswain in charge of the tiller, and another boat's officer. And the boat would be stationed at the creek head. Now, all Kirkcudbright people will recognise this picture. The David Shackleton's house is here, or what was that is the lifeboat station, which became David Shackleton's house there. This is Milburn Street. This is the road up to the cemetery. So we're at the corner just above Tesco's. So this is where the lifeboat was kept. So in each launch, the boat had to be taken on its trolley, I'll go back one, on its trolley to the harbour. Now normally it would be launched at the harbour quay. Now by the quay, I mean the Harbour Square car park, which is at that point part of the harbour. It became a car park once the harbour was filled in 1910. So the boat would be taken to the harbour quay, and if there was room, if there wasn't too much timber lying on the quay, or if there wasn't someone else's boat parts lying on the quay, they could launch at the quay. But it became a bit problematic launching there. They couldn't guarantee that they were going to get space to launch. So they then used, which would be quite strange to us, the ferry terminal. The Kirkcudbright ferry from Kirkcudbright to Merscroft before the bridge was built. So the ferry had a slipway on this side of the river and the other, but the ferry terminal on this side of the river was ideal for launching. They could launch into the river. So you launch into the river and off you go on your rescue, but the rescue is 9 times out of 10 going to be probably the Ross Island. So you've got 5 miles to row before you even think about rescuing anyone. 5 miles to row, probably against the tide, assuredly against the wind. So it would be quite a tough task to get the lifeboat to the vessel that you're going to rescue. The 4 service calls and 17 lives saved. That means she was launched 4 times to 4 vessels, saving 17 lives from those 4 vessels. Each of those vessels was a vessel similar to the ones you saw in the earlier picture, with crews of 3 or 4 aboard them. I think they twice rescued 5, but it's maybe just the way my mind works, but 3 people didn't seem to be enough men to be aboard one of these sailing vessels to handle it. But if they were lying in Manxman's Lake, they would leave a skeleton crew aboard, while the rest of the crew probably came to the town for some entertainment. But weather forecasting at that time was certainly not the way it is. I mean, I know now if I look at my phone, I've got 4 or 5 weather apps. We were all warned about Storm Eowyn a week before it arrived. Weather forecasting in the 1860s was probably red sky at night. The barometer might be seen to fall rapidly, and they would think, oh, don't like the look of that. The sky might look a bit strange. So that would be the strength of their weather forecasting. And accidents would happen. They would be lying in the bay, in parts of the bay that really they shouldn't be in, but that's where they were caught. So 4 service calls, 17 lives over a period of, Can't even think straight. 18 years, thank you. I've got it written here, actually. The next vessel to arrive was a boat called the Mackie. That is not the Mackie. That's the Clinder. I can't find anywhere a photograph of the Mackie. She would be very similar to the previous boat. She was slightly larger. The Mackie was 32 feet. The Helen Lee's was between 29, 30 feet, so she was a bit smaller. But the Mackie, this time, arrived at Kirkcudbright railway station. And there was a great fanfare. The band of the 1st Battalion Kirkcudbright Artillery Volunteers paraded through the town. They took the boat to the harbour. The Countess of Selkirk named the boat. And again, there was a great flurry. The boat would be taken out and rowed around, just as occasionally the lifeboat is brought up to the harbour now and buzzed around. The Mackie was only here a very short period of time, and she didn't save anybody. She had 4 service calls and no rescues. Now, when it says no lives saved, a life saved is a life that would be lost had the lifeboat not been there. So the lifeboat on these service calls may well have assisted people, but at no time would they have died if the lifeboat hadn't been there. So the boat itself would have aided a lot of people, but not technically saved a life. A typical example of what was happening at the time, though, is the Clinder. This was a vessel sailing from New Caledonia to the Clyde, carrying nickel ore, captained by a Captain Roche and 24 German and Dutch crew. Now, as Captain Roche approached the Clyde, he saw Arran, or I thought he did, and turned to starboard to go into the Clyde. Well, he spotted the Mull of Galloway and thought, that'll do, that'll be Arran. Turned to starboard, came up the Solway Firth, was warned as he passed the Ross Island by the lighthouse keepers that he was off course. That would be by some form of signalling, a light signal or whatever. But no, he carried on, and this is him at Burnfoot, where he ran aground at Burnfoot. You'll notice the anchors are still in position. Where's my mouse again? The anchors are still in position here and here, so no attempt to anchor the boat. They simply ran aground. You can see a rope ladder dangling down to get the crew off the boat. Now, strangely, and I've chosen this the picture of the Clinder carefully, my paternal grandparents were born at Burnfoot village. So their families were fisher folk from Burnfoot, and they would have no doubt assisted in the rescue of the Clinder. But it was just typical of the kind of things that was happening. Navigation in those days, especially coastal navigation, was very much time and distance. You know where the compass is pointing you. You know roughly how fast you're going. And you'll have a watch, a clock, so you can time yourself. So you can go on a certain course at a certain speed for a certain time, and you know roughly where you are. But it's not an exact science. And time after time, vessels got themselves into trouble like this. The wind would blow them in. They're all sailing vessels. Some did have auxiliary engines later on, but not the auxiliary engine was really designed to push them into port, not to get them out of trouble. And how do these boats express distress? They don't have radios. So the various ways to express a distress call in those days was fly your ensign, your flag, upside down. Fly a flag, a rectangular flag, with a black ball above it or below it. Ring your bell continuously. Blow your whistle continuously. Fire your gun continuously. Or do any other thing you could to attract attention. Now, somebody has to be there to see that you're in trouble. So time after time, people would be waiting days for rescue. And there was one occasion when the Kirkcudbright Lifeboat was called out to a vessel just off the Ross Island, and it took them 3 days to get to the vessel. Day 1, They set off, they noticed the distress signs had been seen. The boat set off, rowing out past Torres Point, got to Torres Point, and the weather was so atrocious they just couldn't make it any further. They just couldn't go. They couldn't row against the tide or the wind. So they came back. Day 2, they attempted it again. But on day 3, they managed to get alongside the vessel to discover it was deserted. The crew had all gone home. The crew, in the meantime, had managed to abandon ship with their own lifeboat, but left their distress flags flying. So that I can only imagine the language. So the Mackay was here from 1880 to 1887. Following the Mackay became a more, I'm going to say, famous, infamous lifeboat in Kirkcudbright, the Hugh and Anne. She was here 1887 to 1910, and this is a picture of the Hugh and Anne. But she was delivered to Kirkcudbright again by train, but taken quietly to the boathouse. I don't know what had gone wrong with the first episode a few years before with the Mackay, but the Hugh and Anne was taken quietly to the boathouse. She was 22 years on station, and this time accredited with 15 lives. So a much, much busier boat. She was reported to have some issues with heavy weather, handling. Now, these boats had a keel that dropped down the bottom. If you're familiar with sailing, and I know some of you are, again, she was a rowing sailing boat. If you put your sail up without putting your keel down, the boat goes sideways. So to stop the boat going sideways, they drop a keel, and the boat can't go sideways anymore, so it goes forwards. But the boat has to be designed very, very carefully, or the sail configuration has to be put together very carefully, or she'll misbehave. And the windier it gets, the more she'll misbehave. And I think this is what they were experiencing. So the coxswain at the time demanded that they get a new boat. So the RNLI promised them a motorboat. They said, yep, I appreciate you're having difficulty here, we'll give you a motorboat. Well, as you'll discover shortly, it took 20 years to get that motorboat. It took some time. The Hugh and Anne started its life being launched from the creek head again, up just above Tesco's. But so much effort and energy was put into rowing this boat down the river, and the rescues were invariably in the bay, that a decision was made that there should be a lifeboat station built somewhere else in the bay. They thought ideally the Manor Hole, which is out to just the far side of Ross Bay, just at the southern edge of Ross Bay. But the lifeboat inspector arrived, had a look and said, no, that wouldn't do, but chose a site on the current eastern side of the bay, and Kirkcudbright Lifeboat Station was built there. Now, anyone who's walked down towards the lifeboat station, you'll notice it's devoid of trees. It's I don't know the exact date of this photograph, but it is very, very early on. So this was the original lifeboat station built on its existing site. You'll see photographs of the station later on. You'll see some amendments that were made later. And first time we have a really good crew picture. We have no photographs of the crew of the Mackay or the Helen Lees, but we have this photograph of the crew of the Hugh and Anne. A fine mustachioed bunch of men that they are. Now, if we look from the far side, furthest away from me, there's a David Davidson. That's Faith and Rab's grandfather. No family resemblance, I don't think, Rab there. Then there's William Kirkpatrick, John McKill, James McKee, George Parkhill. Now he's the coxswain. This is the guy in the middle with the cap on. George Parkhill's father was the coxswain prior to him. However, on one fair day, George and his father Matthew were heading off down the river. His father Matthew worked as a riverboat pilot, bringing some of these vessels that we saw into the harbour. And Matthew fell overboard, and George attempted to rescue him. He did ultimately get his father's body, but unfortunately he was drowned. So George replaced his father as coxswain. You'll see a photograph of George later on as well. But so we've got George. Next to him, I think, was Frank Gallagher, who again you'll see later on. I'm looking for names on them here. Can you all see names from there? We've got a Matthew Parkhill, not the one that was drowned, obviously. Adam Leckie with the beard and the moustache further in. Henry Dryden. James Wilson. I can see the names now. Back to the far side on the bottom end, we've got David Hoch, then William Miller, William Mackenzie, and James Shields. James Shields is this one. Now, these are all Kirkcudbright names. You would still find most of these families in Kirkcudbright. And if you look at their gear, they've got a coat, a cork life jacket, and a sou'wester. And that was it. That was your protective clothing. To our delicate minds, that they're not. If you've ever been to sea in a winter's night where it's blowing a gale, that's not enough to wear, but that's what they went to sea in. And here they are going to sea. That is the Hugh and Anne launching down Kirkcudbright Slipway. It's obviously an exercise because most, you'll maybe not be able to see from back there, but most people are just wearing a soft cap. They've got their jacket on, and their life jacket over the top. But it's I found that as a very rare picture. Fortunately, that came from Faith's father's archive of photographs. So I would just about guarantee your grandfather will be on there, Rab. Kirkcudbright Harbour at this point had just been modified. The harbour square had been filled in. The new quay wall had been built. But even in 1910, here's the kind of vessel that you would expect to be lying in Kirkcudbright Harbour. I've certainly found photographs of multiple vessels of this nature lying along a harbour wall. What you might notice is there are no fishing boats. Not yet. They arrive, but they're still earlier on. And you can also see how cluttered the harbour wall is with buildings, warehouses. Everything that Kirkcudbright needed, even at the start of 1864, was coming via ship. The train had begun to take over some of the duties, but everything that today comes in an articulated truck, a white van, an Amazon delivery, any special, extravagant buy would come by ship. There were even ships coming directly from France with goods from France. I mean, if you look around Kirkcudbright, some of the grand houses along the High Street, some Castle Street, people living in these houses certainly had cash to spend, and it was all being brought by sea. I mean, whether it was coal, grain, curbstones, a great range of goods was still being brought in by ship. So the trade in Kirkcudbright was still very much based on these coastal schooners. Right, I said in the earlier slide that the Hugh and Anne was here till 1910. They were promised a motorboat. They were given the George Gordon Moir. And here she is, we're still rowing. You can see this, a good photograph of this to see the ranks of men sitting. There are, again, 8 men rowing. The bowman on the bow with the anchor, the coxswain and other crews standing back. The spare rowers would be either under cover at the bow or at the stern. Now, these boats were self-righters, but self-righting in terms of their design. They had no specialist equipment to help them self-right. These high sections at the bow and the stern, when the boat turned upside down, that would lift the boat up. and the balance of the boat would flip it up. But what of the crew? The crew were definitely in the drink. And once you get back aboard, the boat's full of water. So the crew would then be bucketing for quite a while to empty the vessel. And if it capsized in the first place, it was probably rough enough that every time they threw a bucket of water at one side, a wave would deposit in the other. So you would be avoiding capsizes like the plague. There is no record of a boat capsizing on the Kirkcudbright station. They did capsize, but definitely not on the Kirkcudbright station. So again, this is a pulling sailing boat. 5 service calls, and this time 10 lives. We're still rescuing schooner crew. There's no mentions of fishing boats yet, or pleasure boats. It's all commercial vessels that these boats are going to, and they're all being rescued within Kirkcudbright Bay. Now, for those that aren't acquainted with the shape of Kirkcudbright Bay, and I'm sure you all are, here are 2 charts. These are modern charts of Kirkcudbright Bay and the North Irish Sea, Kirkcudbright Bay at the far side, obviously. The charts of the time that were used would be grey-scale. There would be no colour on them. But to give you some idea of the colour, yellow is land, green is mud or sand, and blue is shallow water going to white, which is deeper water. Now, we all know Kirkcudbright is not all land. These are charts show what the bay would look like when the tide is out. When the tide comes in, obviously, the whole thing becomes blue. So the Manxman's Lake itself is here, where all those bodies and vessels were found. The dune is here. The Manor Hole that I was talking about, where they proposed building a lifeboat station, was there, but the current boathouse is here. So all the rescues to date have taken place on that chartlet at the far side. Nothing much beyond the Ross Island, if at all beyond the Ross. At each side of the Ross Island there's an anchorage, which is a place where ships would choose to anchor. But for the eagle eye among you, you'll notice that there's an area where there's blue water here, but then there's a green patch here. Now that's known as the bar. There is a bar in Kirkcudbright Bay, which is sometimes, well, I've certainly walked across it and didn't get my knees wet. At dead low water and some of the biggest tides, you can walk across the mouth of Kirkcudbright Bay and then walk up to the dune if you want. You'll need to remember where the bar is for part of this talk later on. But the bar is one horrendous place. Again, for non-sailors, shallow water is horrible. Deep water is where you want to be. If you're in trouble, go to deep water. You don't want to be caught in shallow water where the waves are breaking and it becomes very unpleasant. Well, the bar is one of those very unpleasant places. With the introduction of the next boat I'm going to show you, the rescue area suddenly opens up from that little blotch there, Kirkcudbright Bay, to most of this area here. Not as far south as Isle of Man, not as far across, well, I'm not going to say not as far across. I've certainly been on service calls over onto the Cumbrian coast. But that general area is what's about to change. So there's going to be a shift change in the rescues from Kirkcudbright Bay to the North Irish Sea. And what allowed that to happen was the Priscilla McBean. And this is the Priscilla McBean on display as she is today. She was a 35-foot petrol-powered lifeboat. She doesn't look a lot different to the lifeboats I was showing in the pictures earlier on. She still has Rolex. She still has a mast and a sail. So they haven't changed a lot, but they have put an engine into it, which radically changed the story. The previous boat, the Gordon Moyer, had to be taken to Maryport. So she had to be rowed to Maryport. Maryport is there. So Kirkcudbright's over here, there's Maryport. So the Gordon Moyer has to be taken to Maryport. And after 2 attempts. The successful attempt, it took the poor guys 16 hours to row this boat to Maryport. I can only imagine. But on picking up the Priscilla McBean, it took them 3 hours to come back, sitting on their backsides, watching the world go by. A complete change. She had 5 service calls and 1 life accredited, although you'll note from the time she was only here from 1928 to 1931. She was very much a prototype motor lifeboat. But they hadn't quite moved away from the idea of oars and sails yet. So after 1931, another motorboat was provided. And this boat stayed for quite some time. It was here from 1931 to 1953, the Morrison Watson. 35 feet 6 inches with a 35 horsepower diesel engine capable of 7 knots. Just think, a knot's its speed. Just think of knots as miles per hour. It's not worth worrying too much. So it went at just over walking pace. She would self-right in 4 seconds. She might, but the crew don't. So again, you'll be in the water. But what you'll notice now is suddenly the service calls over the past few slides have been increasing. We've now gone to 30 service calls in its lifetime here, with 15 lives saved. And this is one of the crew photographs. We've got Jim Poland, another well-known Kirkcudbright name at the far end. The next crew member in is George Parkhill Jr., more Parkhills. Then we have J. Parkhill, A. Hastings, Frank Gallagher, who was in the photograph earlier on. But more importantly, we've still got George Parkhill, the coxswain, who was in that earlier photograph. He was the guy who tried to rescue his father. What I didn't mention in the previous, and Jim Maxwell, when we come to Angus Fairweather, who's the guy leaning back slightly. Excuse me. Angus Fairweather was one of the owners of Fairweather's Garage, which was just positioned this side of the road bridge on the left as you come over the bridge. The garage was to the side. The boats now needed a mechanic. And he was the mechanic on the previous boat, and he was also the mechanic on this boat. Because a petrol engine in a wet boat is going to give you problems. So we now, the new position of mechanic appears on the lifeboat for the first time. We've got Ian Weems, Bill Robson. For anyone that's into the art world, Bill Robson was an artist from Dildon. And another Poland, Jock Poland at this end. Again, looking at their attire, they're still in a long coat, they're welly boots, they're probably waders actually. A rudimentary kapok-filled life jacket, which would be fine for the first wee while in the water, but as it became saturated, it became more a weight than a life jacket. So again, the crew themselves are not that well equipped yet. Well equipped to the standards of the day, but compared to what you're about to see, they're still quite poorly equipped. So here is the Morrison Watson under sail. She might be a motor lifeboat, but she's also a sailing lifeboat. They're not giving up their sails, and for the eagle-eyed amongst you, they're not giving up the oars either. But this boat only has 1 engine, and I've already said that 1 engine may well give you problems. So if the engine's going to pack in, you've still got a sail and you've still got oars. Just going back to the previous slide a second. At the bottom, Mary B, 15th of December 1944. Now the Mary B is not a lifeboat. The Mary B was a vessel that this lifeboat went to rescue. Now this is the Mary B Mitchell. A 130-foot topsail schooner built in steel, and she ran aground on the Kirkcudbright Bar. You now know where that is. On the 15th of December 1944. The Morrison Watson crew went out, rescued the crew off the vessel, brought them ashore, and the plan was to return the crew to the vessel the following day. Well, unfortunately, the following day, the wreckage was on the Senex shore. Now, this vessel is often mistaken for the wreck at the Doon. It's not the wreck at the Doon. The wreck at the Doon is a vessel called the Monreath. The Mary B lies down below Senex Churchyard, right down the Senex shore. There's very little of her left, but there's still some of it. But the anchor from the Mary B is one of the centerpieces on the harbour wall. There's a big black anchor on the harbour wall. This is the vessel it came from. This vessel was built as a private yacht. And she was going to be a private yacht, but turned quite quickly to a commercial vessel. She was a Q ship during the First World War, where she was armed, and she was a lure. She was there to encourage the submarines, German submarines, U-boats, to surface and attack it on the surface. Little did they know she was also armed with quite a large cannon on the rear deck. For any vintage film watchers, she was also the Marie Celeste in Hollywood's version of the Marie Celeste, so she had a Hollywood career as well. But she came to grief on Kirkcudbright Bar. Here she is ashore near Senex. That was the following day, I think, from the photographer's notes. But within days, she was totally destroyed in a storm. Now, at last, we're moving on to a lifeboat that most people recognise, the J.B. Cooper. From 1953 to 1965, a Liverpool class. The mechanic in the previous photograph, Angus Fairweather, was a coxswain for a year. Then Faith's father, George, Rab's uncle George, he became coxswain in 1950, and he was the coxswain of the J.B. Cooper until 65. There's a reason for that. She was not a self-righter. So if she capsized, she stayed capsized. Now you might think, whoa, that's not so good. There were pros and cons. The self-righting boats didn't behave very well in the sea. They had to be built in such a way that there was so much windage that when the wind blew, and invariably a lifeboat's out in the wind, she was difficult to steer. The J.B. Cooper was not. This one had 2 engines, but it's only just when I realised doing this talk, twin 18 horsepower engines. They're tiny, absolutely tiny. She has 35 launches and saved 17 lives. But now, most of the rescues are small fishing boats. The mood has moved from the schooners to the commercial fishing fleet. Here we have the J.B. Cooper being rehoused. George Davidson at the far end. The plaque at that end is how the service calls were recorded. In the boathouse itself, there's a line of boards, and the boards would be hand-painted with each call, the date, and the rescue carried out. And here we have some of the crew of the J.B. Cooper. Did I see Tanya? I'm sure I saw Tanya. Right? Tanya's dad, Joey Sassoon, as a boy. Tommy Collin. Tim Jeffs, the weaver from High Street. Bob Bing McKee. Now, again, Bing is Willie McKee's father. George Davidson. Robert Mitchell, tucked in behind, who had Osborne's and the Undertakers. Gordon Belford, who worked for the Mitchells. Robert Milligan. And Jimmy Davidson, who was the brother of George. Right, Faith, you ready? 100 years since we've got a lifeboat. So here we have Faith presenting Lord Saltoun, and I think Lord Saltoun presenting Faith a box of chocolates as well. And again, the crew on that day, we've got Joe Sassoon again, Jock King of West Coast Sea Products, Charlie Devlin, Jake Jimison. Jake worked in the mill just behind his head. Just behind Jake's head, you'll see a large brick and concrete building, which was the SAI mill in the harbour wall. It's a 4-storey building. It was huge. Tommy Thompson, George in the middle, and again, Bing McKee at this end. And here we have the boat, fully dressed for the centenary celebrations. Notice the creamery in the background, which now seems like a big empty space with the chimney and the... Now, to be the lifeboat coxswain, especially for as long as Faith's father was, the family had to be involved. You couldn't work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and not have the family involved. So here's an occasion where obviously the boat's been out, I suspect on an exercise, and we've got George's wife Ola with the basket with the flask and the cups and the biscuits in it. There was no provision in the boathouse for making cups of tea. There's no fresh water. There's no electricity for a long time. So she would go down, and again, we've got Faith at the front here. Now, I was going to mention another story there, but I'm going to flick it. I'll leave it for later. And here's another photograph again of George's wife Ola and his daughter Jane. A couple of reasons for this picture, apart from the fact Jane looks cute in the sou'wester and the life jacket. It's still a sou'wester and a Cape Hook life jacket. Things haven't really moved on. I could have taken this photograph back 60 years and it's still the same equipment. And also, you'll need to notice, and I know you think it's trivial at the moment, but it'll be obvious, there's a hole in the front of the boat there where the paint rubbed off a bit. That's where a chain called the bow preventer went through. While the boat was pulled into the boathouse, a chain was put through the bow to hold it, and the weight was taken off the steel cable that was pulling it in. So the bow preventer held the boat in place. You'll know why that's important later on. Just before 1965, because we're getting a new boat, some alterations had to be made to the boathouse. Some quite radical alterations. It had to be extended and the door had to be lifted. Note the health and safety. They're up here, he's in his suit, he's in his tweed suit, and I don't know what they're knocking off, but it doesn't look very safe. The reason for the alterations is the Mary Pullman. From 1965 till 89, she was an Oakley class, again, coxswained by George, a self-righter, but notice now we've got twin 54 horsepower diesel engines. Now that is a big move to have a diesel engine. But she was still only capable of 8 knots. But 8 knots into anything. A gale or a storm, she went at 8 knots. The wave might be 20 feet in front of you. She still went at 8 knots. She just thumped through everything. Communications have now been stepped up. We have an MF set and later a VHF radio. Decca navigation was fitted. It wasn't that great to have Decca navigation. The most useful point of Decca navigation was the Decca aerial that was on behind the Isle of Whithorn. It was a huge, tall mast with red lights on it, and if you were at sea at night, you could see it. As soon as you went outside the Ross, there it was, so you knew where the Isle of Whithorn basically was. She was fitted with a radar in 1980, and George and myself were sent off to Leith Nautical College for a week to learn how to use this newfangled thing. It radically changed a lot of the work a lifeboat did. But we now have 89 service calls and 34 lives saved. On the 16th of May, 76, there was a vellum rescue. Now, a vellum rescue is a rescue just a stage below somebody getting a medal. And it was 2 fishermen on a rock on the Senex shore in a southeasterly gale. They got themselves onto a rock and they were fishing away in this gale. The tide started to come in and the waves started to break over them, so the boat had to be taken across to rescue them. And the sea, I wasn't on that rescue. Were you there, Rab? Were you in that one? No. The sea was quite horrendous. George retired from lifeboat service in 1984. And Joy Sassoon took over for a year. The reason Joy took over for a year is they were having difficulty finding someone to replace George as coxswain. I was actually offered the post, but I was a teacher at the time, and it would have been financial suicide, apart from the fact I'd only just taken a job where I wasn't in the town all day, every day. I was out of town all day, every day. So Joy took over the post while Stephen Unsworth, who came across from the Isle of Man, was going to take on the post as coxswain. But Joy gave him the year so he could get to know the area and get to know the boat. But during that spell, there was another vellum rescue on the 26th of November, 1984. It was a boat called the Leon Janine. She was coming into the bay, ended up on Kirkcudbright Bar in the southeasterly gale, grounded, and the crew members were stuck. So the boat was duly launched, but I think it should have been an equity card most of the crew had, because we had acting coxswain Stephen Unsworth, acting second coxswain me, assistant mechanics. Colin, you were there that night, I remember, holding my shirt. And we rescued the crew off the Leon Janine, and were again not awarded a medal for it, but awarded this vellum. And just shortly after that, Stephen Unsworth was the coxswain from 95 until 98. I'll just rattle through these. Here's the boathouse with the alterations. You can see the light grey at the front is where the door had to be lifted to get the Oakley in. And here are some of the, again, well-known faces by now of the crew. I like their hats. They cut a certain dash. Question that's often asked is, could the lifeboat launch at any stage of the tide? Yes, it could launch. It couldn't necessarily go anywhere, but it could launch. Maybe it couldn't go over the bar, but we could get into the water. This is George at the bottom, checking to see if it was possible to launch. This was for a service call. Here's myself at the top in the orange trousers, with Jill, Tommy Gibson, standing beside me. Tommy, who's Jill's ex-husband, he was the winchman on the boat. He was there. He was the poor soul that had to stay ashore and wait till all the excitement was past. So George came up the slip. Could we launch? Of course we could. So in she went. And then afloat. We just had to slide across a bit of mud at the bottom of the slipway. The Oakley, though, suffered problems. This was the first version of the Oakley, on the trailer, very similar to the first boat Kirkcudbright had. 2 masts, cable aerials. She was then revamped into a boat with a radar scanner, a little more protection for the crew at the back of the boat, and just before she was withdrawn from service, given a wheelhouse. This is the Kirkcudbright boat. I think that's Willie McKee. I think Willie Henry, actually. Gavin Scott. It's a very legal team. Excuse me. But she had to be withdrawn from service. The self-righting system on this boat didn't rely on the shape of the boat anymore. It relied on water ballast. So there were great big aluminium tanks in the bottom of the boat, which filled with seawater. Now, for those that are familiar with seawater and aluminium, they don't mix particularly well. And there was an electrolysis that happened between the seawater and aluminium, which caused the wood to rot. So the hull of the boat began to suffer. And here's an Oakley stripped of all its timbers. And they all had to be replaced. That was always a very costly exercise. Now, just at this stage, I'll just put this one up while I'm talking. Here's a list of coxswains. There's a reason why this list of coxswains goes on here, because this is the end of the coxswains of Kirkcudbright Lifeboat. During this period, I had to stand back from lifeboat service. I'd just taken a new job, as I said. I was out of town all the time. I had a young family. Just bought a new house. There was too much going on in life. You're not retained in the lifeboat crew. There's no payment for retainer. You're there as a volunteer, and you're free to come and go as you please. Unlike the fire brigade that have a retention scheme, lifeboat crew, it's your choice. But in the early, so I was 85 was when I finished. But in early 88, a knock came to the door, and it was Alex Strachan on behalf of the RNLI to see if I would run some evaluation trials for the Atlantic 21. Which, having thought about it for a while, I thought, yeah, I would. So in June 88, 4 people from Kirkcudbright headed off to Cowes in the Isle of Wight. There was myself and Alistair Galone, who were at that point not involved in the lifeboat crew, Colin Marshall, and a man called Ian Fulton. And thanks, Stephen, we now know who Dino was. We headed off to Cowes. We hadn't seen an Atlantic 21 before. What is this wonderful boat? It's a rib, which is a rigid inflatable boat, so it's got a hard hull with a rubber fringe around it. The hull itself is a planing hull. It doesn't sit into the water when it goes, it flies through the water. So, I found my volunteers, let the journey commence. The first experience of an Atlantic 21 was this. I'm the one in the blue helmet. I'm not sure who the other 2 are. One of them might be you, Colin. One's certainly Alistair. Before they'd let us go anywhere in the Atlantic 21, we had to experience a capsize, which really boosts your confidence. You're here for a week, but we're going to teach you what to do if the boat capsizes. So the Atlantic 21 is a self-righter. Here she is, completely upside down. Here are the crew over here on the end of this rope. The reason for that is you can't be anywhere near the boat when it decides to right. But you have control. You pull the rope, it fires a gas cylinder, fills that bag, and the boat comes up. But she comes up with quite a bit of force. And then she flips onto her feet. You can see from that how quickly it's come up. Then the crew climb back in, and off you go. The engines will restart, because they've been marinized in such a way that no water they stop automatically when the boat goes upside down. The intakes are all sealed. So when she rights again, all that sorts itself out, and she should restart. So after we'd been on the course, we'd been with helicopter exercises, night exercises, rough sea exercises driving the boat up a beach. And the competition was to get the boat up the beach and into the car park. It was a pebble beach. So you hit the beach doing about 20 knots and the boat would just keep going. You would expect it to stop, but it didn't. It just kept going. It was quite an experience. So we had a week of doing everything you could imagine with an Atlantic 21. So a boat was eventually sent here on trial. In that picture, you've got Bob Mack, who was a GP for a while here, Alan Johnson, and myself on the wheel. So the trials were run with 12 months, we were told, and they began on the 24th of July. We'd have some trials. Now, this is a step change in, I don't know why my titles haven't come up there. This is a major step change in lifeboats. If you remember, the speed of the last boat was 8 knots. This one would do 32 knots. It was just incredibly different. She had a casualty capacity of 22. I don't know where the heck we'd have put 22 if we ever had them, but apparently it was 22. Twin 50 horsepower engines, later upgraded to 75 horsepower. They were 2 strokes. You had to, at that time, we had to mix petrol and oil together, but they were extremely powerful engines. With a VHF, it carried a crew of 3. As you now know, it was self-righting. But I don't have a crew. There is no crew. There's Alistair, there's Colin, There's Ian Fulton and myself who have been trained to use this boat. And I have to find people now, but not poach from the existing lifeboat crew, which is still manning the Oakley lifeboat. Most of them were actually too old. I had to find crew who were between 18 and 45, fit and healthy, no colour vision, and unfortunately, Rab, no specs.
Too old and wore specs.
I think that's what I told you at the time. You were too old and you wore specs. So I have to find a group of people who fit that criteria, who aren't currently on the lifeboat, so it's a completely new group of people. And you'll notice we've got Blue Peter 1. So anyone that donated to the Blue Peter appeals back in the day, we had one of their boats for a time. Oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. The day the first boat arrived, this is the very first boat, this is Blue Peter 1. This is Alistair Galone with the beard. He's scratching his head because an engine's just broken down. We didn't even get out the harbour. We set off, the boat arrived, round the harbour, showing it off, got to Castle Point, just beyond the marina, one of the engines stopped. So we brought it back in one engine, and Alistair scratched his head to try and wonder what it is. You'll notice the guy in the bow is not in the 18 to 45 age group. It's George Davidson again. He's maybe retired, but he's still involved. And here he is giving instructions to get us back onto the trailer. The boat was fixed. Men were found, but they had to be trained. So here we are. I said a crew of 3. I think there are 6 people in this boat. We had to find crew, take them out into the bay, see if they liked riding on the boat. And it was the difference between sitting in a bus and riding a motorbike. If you were in the Oakley, you were on a bus, going at 8 miles an hour. In this thing, you were on a motorbike and you knew it. You were completely exposed to the weather. As a result, we all wore dry suits, crash helmets. Later on, the helmets had intercom, so you could speak to each other. Other than that, you just had to shout and scream at each other. You couldn't hear anything. And fairly decent life jackets at the time. They've improved dramatically. We had to prove the boat could tow. So here's a little towing exercise just north of the Isle Point. Things moved a bit quicker than we expected, though. As I said before, the Oakley was suffering from construction problems. She was beginning to deteriorate badly. And by the 18th of April, 89, she had deteriorated to a point she wasn't seaworthy anymore. She had to be changed. So although we were given a year to run the trials, and when I say trials, we weren't trialing the boat. We were trialing, is that kind of boat suitable for the job here? Can it do what Kirkcudbright Lifeboat Station needs? And at this point, needs have changed again. We've gone from rescuing fishing boats, although we did rescue a couple of fishing boats with this. No, we certainly rescued the crew. But it was more to leisure, not paddle boarders at the time, which are becoming more prevalent now, but certainly smaller leisure boats were needing to be rescued. But we were supplied with the Spix Macaw, which was put on station as a relief boat, but was now the Kirkcudbright Lifeboat. So I've had to find a group of people, train them to a point where they can now be labelled as Kirkcudbright Lifeboat crew. And in the few months that we had, we managed to do that. 16 launches of the Spix Macaw, and we saved 1 life. It was a swimmer out of the dune. Now, that would have been unheard of 100 years earlier. A group of teenagers in the dune one evening, one of them came up with the smart idea that he would swim to the lifeboat station from the dune. He got out, his party noticed he hadn't come back, so phoned the Coast Guard and said he hasn't come back. So we were tasked to go and find him. At that point, the lifeboat was kept in the harbour. So on the way down the river, we had to check every river buoy, And as we got to the Isle Point, in the pitch dark, I might add, you could hear the little plaintive cries of help. And here he was clinging to seaweed on top of a rock as the tide was making. He was very cool, shall we say. He took a bit of warming up. Another typical rescue for the Atlantic was we had set off an overnight search, which carried on all night off the Burgh Head, which is just south of the Isle of Whithorn, for an overdue vessel and its crew. I think there were 5 units, including a helicopter, looking for this guy. And I remember quite clearly, we were about 2 miles off the Burgh Head, approaching on our search pattern, and here was this head in the water, and oh, for goodness sake, here's a head, hair all wet. And I'd warned the crew who were sitting behind me, look, we've got a head coming up. As we approached to pick up the head, it was a lobster pot. But it had hair, the weed and everything was, oh, whew. Thank goodness for that. Another interesting search with this one was we were asked to go and look for a body in the River Cree. A woman had gone missing from a nightclub on the Saturday night, and we were asked to go and search the River Cree. Now, it's something that none of the previous boats could either think of doing, so we managed to get the lifeboat up to the A75 bridge at the River Cree. We didn't find her, but unfortunately she was found the next day, very close to where she went in. Which brings me to a story which I'm going to tell. This Christmas, our daughter was home. Now, she's 42 now, and she's about to come up in one of the photographs, actually. And I was saying I was going to do this talk, and she said, oh, Dad, that's quite interesting. I always remember when you'd come back from a call, and Mum would say, how did you get on? And you'd say, well, actually, we only got the body. You'd whisper, we just got the body. And she said, I've often wondered, what did you do with all the heads? Okay, how some minds work. So we also had a few bodies with heads. But just shortly after this, we're given our own boat. The Peter and Grace Ewing, she was here from 91 till 2006. She was the first Atlantic permanently in the station, launched 139 times, accredited for 11 lives. In 97, a crew room was built. It's in the town, just behind the fire station, which meant we could keep the Land Rover there, keep it clean. Something I didn't add earlier on, and it was on my notes. When the lifeboat station was built in 1892, there was no road to the lifeboat station. The crew were taken by horse and cart to Whapcroft, where Bud Gordon lives, and they had to run or walk from there to the lifeboat station. But they thought that was better than rowing from the harbour to there, which I can only agree. The Kirkcudbright crew, up until the Priscilla McBean was introduced, also manned the Auchencairn lifeboat. So they were taken by horse and cart to Auchencairn to man the lifeboat there. So I think now, I don't know what the record is now, but when I was the senior helmsman, I was the first coxswain of this boat. This helmsman and coxswain, the name became a bit mixed up. We were looking at probably 15 minutes from being asked to launch to launching. How do you know that the boat needs to be launched? How did that happen? In previous boats, the rowing boats up until about 1920, people would simply go round doors. Come on, Jimmy, the boat's needed. Come on, Willie, come on, so-and-so. And the boat would be assembled. From 1920s, they fired maroons. Now, these were fired from a 6-inch mortar. It was a pack of explosives slightly bigger than a bag of sugar, which you lit the fuse, dropped into the mortar, and stood well back. And this thing went off, fired up this this lump of stuff into the air, which exploded in the sky, shooting out 2 green stars and making the loudest bang you have ever heard. And we fired 2 of those for each required launch. I personally would fire maroons, and sometimes, but often, I used the telephone to call the crew out, especially if it was a night call, because there's nothing worse than going out in a boat of this nature unprepared. You don't want to turn up in your pyjamas and your thin socks. You want to turn up properly kitted before you put your dry suit on. What am I doing for time? Oh, I'm moving on. Photograph of the Atlantic from above. These cylinders here, these white gas cylinders, they're the cylinders for inflating this bag in the back. Here we have the daughter who asked me about the heads, making a presentation to Lady Henderson. This is Admiral Sir Nigel Henderson with his back to us, Faith off to the left there, and the little lad in the middle with the kilt on here, this is my son. He'll appear shortly. Not quite looking like that. So here are the first list of crew members. I'm sure you'll recognise many of the names. So is Alistair, Stephen Eccles, Robert Ross, Colin, Stephen Little, Gavin Brown, Alan Johnson, Rodney Maxwell, the electrician, Chris Coop, Bob Mack, Alex Smith, Jimmy Denny, who works at Crosby and Bateman's, Tommy Thompson and Ted Eccles, shore helpers. Tommy Thompson was in most of those photographs. He's about to come up. Here's Tommy here and Ted. They came to us from the Oakley crew.
On those lines.
Not as 18 to 45-year-olds, but they worked on the shore. They were the shore helpers who basically had the rough end of the stick. We were out having fun. They're sitting in the boathouse, freezing cold. The boats, but then began to change in their style. That's an Atlantic 21 at the top. This might look like an Atlantic 21 closer, but it's much bigger. They're now making the same boat bigger. So that's an Atlantic 75. 75 means it's 7.5 meters long. The Atlantic 21 was 7.2 meters long. The current boat in the Kirkcudbright station is an Atlantic 85, so she's 8.5 meters long. So the size thing, here we are, Atlantic 85. That is the current boat on station. Self-righting, will do 35 knots, carries a crew of 4, has a VHF radio, which is a line-of-sight radio, which is very efficient. AIS, which is an automatic identification system. You can see other vessels. Technical. There's a screen about the size of this lectern with all the information you need, including satellite navigation, radar, positions of various other craft around you. It's currently in station. 148 launches and 160 people assisted. That is its equivalent to lives saved. Here she is going down the slipway. Quite a different approach to the old-fashioned ones where you were absolutely drenched as soon as you hit the water. How am I doing? Yeah, I'm finishing. The future. Lifeboats now look like this. Offshore lifeboats look like that. It's a cross between a rib, an Atlantic-type boat, with a cabin on it. If you remember an earlier slide, I said the boat had twin 18-horsepower engines. This boat has twin 700-horsepower engines. The boat above that has twin 1,200-horsepower engines. The step change is just unrecognizable in 200 years. My future in the lifeboat is here. This is my son, who's currently a helm of the Stranraer lifeboat. So his great-great-grandfather was in the 1910 photograph. This is my grandson, who looks like he's got aspirations to join the crew as well. Now, we're running out of time rapidly, so that's my last page. What I want to do to close is ask my wife Faith to read a poem written by her father, George Davidson. It's No, I'll let her explain it. I won't explain anymore. I'll leave her to explain. And, I've just been switched off. Right. There you go. Just plug into that. Okay. There you go. You've got it.
Hello, folks. The poem I'm going to read is autobiographical in nature. It was first published in the RNLI's Self-Writer magazine, that's the staff magazine, in 1985. Now, it was penned in such a way that any young crew member could claim or could see themselves being the boy in this poem. Now, it was sent anonymously to that setup, and there was a footnote printed at the bottom of the page, obviously, and it read this: "This dramatic poem was sent without a covering note to identify the poet. Self-writers detectives looked at the postmark Dumfries, but could glean no more information. To the anonymous and talented writer, thank you." As far as I can remember, the poem didn't have a title, but that was just Dad. He didn't title things. Two falling stars of green, the wisps of smoke, shredded and scattered by the southeast gale. The whispered bangs, and half the town awoke, and men came tumbling out, prepared to sail. The youngest lad, half-clad but undetermined, bareheaded, breathless, brash, and first away, and then his elders, storm-rigged, booted, spurred, full battle order, ready for the fray. The heavy doors were wrestled back and pinned, while someone laid the bow preventer clear. By now, the strident voices of the wind were drowned by engines revving out of gear. And then the shout, "Let go!" Away she sped into the black, dark wilderness of night. The coxswain fought the wheel to fetch her head close to the wind to stem the friendly light. One flash, a heartbeat long, then black as pitch, that seemed to last forever. How she yawed and staggered, veered and slewed, the wayward bitch. And then the lighthouse flashed again, thank God. 3/4 ebb and wind against the tide. The bar was shallow, now and hissing white, with foam in streaks like brush strokes side to side across the wild, dark canvas of the night. Black walls of water from God knows how far, seas that were spawned 100 miles away, unbalanced, burst in turmoil on the bar, and disappeared astern in sheets of spray. But now we're clear and squared away southwest, the graveyard watch, and still 2 hours to steam. No comfort now, no warmth, no bloody rest, as long as we have this weather on the beam. The hourglass, fettered now, no longer free. The cold that thicks the blood has slowed the sand. An hour to go DR before we see the even darker darkness of the land. The driving rain has turned to searing sleet that blinds the eyes but never slacks the pace. The diesel's drumming never missed a beat. Such music keeps the smile on Selwyn's face. And then the Coast Guard crackled on the air. The casualty is safe now, making way. Return to station. When will you be there? Later, we'd call and give our ETA. The flame that spurred us out no longer burned, cheated of worthwhile deeds that might have been. Wet, cold, and weary, as for home we turned, and still that bloody bar is in between. 3 hours at least to dodge and wait for tide, with Captain Calt on board and Mal de Mer. Poor shipmates these, who tempt us on inside. But wait we must, for there's no room to err. At last, the run for home is on, streaming the drogue in case she tries to broach. Grey faces in the grey half-light of dawn see boathouse lights come on at our approach. The breasting rope is rove, the shoreline caught by freezing fingers throbbing now with pain. The heel is on, the span is rigged and taut. The job is over now. She's home again. Rehoused, refueled, fit once more for sea. The boat at least, but what about the men? No shame on them, the choice is always free. If someone failed to turn out again. 2 falling stars of green lit up the sky. Bangs to arouse the dead awoke the men. The same old faces, Christ, I wonder why, and how that bloody boy was first again. Thank you. Okay.